Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to yet more Warhammer 40k lore. Today, we are going to take a look at one of the Tau's subject species, or, well, subjects might not technically be the correct term for the Kroot. Mercenaries might be closer to reality. The Kroot are a fairly fascinating little bunch. They, at some point in their history, evolved from some form of avian creature, and in doing so, they gained quite a few interesting abilities. You see, the Kroots have a very, very special digestive system. Very, very special. In fact, it's so goddamn special that I'd say it's probably one of the most ridiculous things in 40k, and that's bloody saying something. The Kroots have the rather unique ability to absorb the DNA structure of anything they eat, and not only absorb it, but analyze it and utilize it. Essentially, if a Kroot eats something, and he eats enough of it, he can eventually replicate the capabilities of the creature he is eating. And he can do this to a fairly ludicrous degree. Now, something relatively simple, let's say that a Kroot eats a lot of orcs. Orcs are of course known for their ridiculous biology and their ability to continuously grow and grow muscles for however long the orc actually remains alive. There is absolutely no, at least no known, barrier to orc growth. In fact, the famous war bosses, the one that the Emperor himself defeated on Ulanor, was said to be the size of a fucking scout titan. So yeah, they can get pretty big. But the Kroots can eat orcs, and they can gain what I would probably describe as a variant of the orcish ability to continuously grow. Now, exactly how this is done, beats fucking me, I'm not a biologist. And honestly, even if you asked a biologist, I'm pretty sure he would just tell you, that's not how that fucking works, so yeah. This is one of those, yes, Warhammer 40k is not accurate on this particular point. Now, I'm sure you could actually technically absorb something else's DNA, because we've been doing this in laboratories for a while, trying to splice and intermix species, but for a single creature to eat another creature, and thereby get its DNA, analyze its DNA, and replicate the specific parts of said DNA it wants, yeah, if that exists in real life, I haven't heard of it, although it would be fucking awesome. But then again, if such a creature existed, I'm wondering why we humans managed to rise to the top of the biological food chain. Nevertheless, here's the thing. They can't completely replicate the orcs' ability to grow indefinitely. And the orcs themselves are a product of Old One technology, so the whole growing indefinitely thing is pretty fucking hard to pull off to begin with. But they can take a part of it. Over a period of time, the Kroot will be able to, how shall I put it, to absorb the orc's ability to expand the rate at which they grow muscle mass. Now, any living creature essentially has a bit of a cap on how much muscle mass it can possibly acquire. This is the same for the Kroot. They can't continuously grow like the orcs, but by eating orcs, they can get a hell of a lot stronger than any Kroot could ever normally get. Which, again, might sound simple to begin with, but if you actually look into how goddamn fucking complicated it would be to create a growth formula like this that only targets muscle fiber, and does it in such a way that it does not completely debilitate the host, oh, yeah, not simple. Not simple at bloody all. But that's not even the worst case. No, in fact, Kroots are so ridiculously adaptive when it comes to this that even the Tyranids are wondering how the fuck they're doing it. They are capable of eating birds or flying creatures, and eventually, eating enough of them, they figure out how to grow functional wings. Now, if you thought building an infinite amount of muscle mass was complicated, managing to make a Kroot into a creature that can fly effectively, yeah, that's pretty hard too. However, though, this might sound like an incredibly useful ability, and, well, it is, obviously, but it's a bit of a double-edged sword. Here's the thing. Once a Kroot starts absorbing DNA, he might not always be able to, shall we say, calibrate how said DNA affects his body. And if he eats too much of it, the changes might be irreversible, and they might not be the changes they want. An interesting factoid, you might have seen some different variants of Kroots, like hounds or Krootoks or the Great Nalok. These are all the same species. The Kroot hound is technically the same creature as a normal Kroot, but the hound, way back in the day, has essentially reached an evolutionary dead end. They began to eat other creatures, absorbing their abilities, and this was way back in the early days of the Kroots, before they gained any sort of spacefaring, etc. Kind of their, early Middle Ages, Bronze Ages stuff, when they were experimenting with their new abilities. Eventually, they managed to eat themselves into a bit of a dead end. They can no longer eat the DNA of other creatures in such a way that allows them to evolve away from their current state, and the evolutionary dead end having limited their brain capacity and their adaptability for evolution. Things like opposable thumbs, for example, is pretty important if you're going to be looking at something along the lines of a higher life form. They're fucked. They are now stuck as Kroot hounds forever. There is virtually no chance, beyond intervention by the Tau, that they could ever evolve into any intelligent... well, that's the question. Are dogs intelligent? Well, yes, to a certain degree, but, not as smart as proper Kroot, shall we properly say. They just can't do it. And no matter how much or how specific a DNA they eat, they just can't do it, because they can't use it properly. This is, of course, a bit of a fear amongst all Kroot, because the current dominant species, the proper Kroot, have essentially kind of won the genetic lottery. They have managed to eat the right DNA, allowing them to become bipedal tool users, which is, as far as we are aware anyways, kind of a requisite for a species to evolve into anything along the lines of, well, what we are today, a civilized society with technology, etc. It's possible that it's possible to do this in other ways, but, well, hasn't happened yet, so we don't really know about it. As you can probably already imagine, the idea that they might one day be turned into slavering woof-woofs has got the Kroots a little bit nervous. As such, they devised a system to make sure that this wouldn't happen to them. The various Kroot clans will designate a ruling body of military and spiritual leaders, known as Kroot Shapers. Their job is to identify any useful traits amongst the creatures they fight, and thereafter direct their kindred to devour the correct pieces of flesh, so to say. For example, say that if they come across a species that's very strong but very dumb, if they eat the wrong parts, they might fuck over their own mental capacities. It is then up to the Shaper to figure out how they can gain the strength DNA without having to gain the dumb part. Precisely how the Shapers do this, however, is not entirely well known. Seeing as the Kroot are not a particularly scientifically advanced species, you're not going to find Kroots wandering around in a lab coat testing DNA samples to try and figure out how to do this, let's just say. But it is suggested in several occasions that the Shapers possess a heightened version of the senses the Kroots have. The senses that it essentially tells them that eating this is good, eating this is bad, so they don't, for example, devour some kind of poisonous parts of the creature they're eating, stuff like that. Apparently, the Shapers can taste the DNA, and via that taste, they can figure out its useful qualities, how to isolate said useful qualities, and how to get rid of the qualities they don't want. How exactly this works? Well, I haven't the faintest. In fact, trying to describe how DNA tastes would be like trying to explain what the color blue sounds like. It's fairly pointless, because we simply do not have the senses necessary. Nevertheless, the Kroot do. Now, again, as you might imagine, if you have a species that evolves and gains the best parts of other animals when they eat them, this would naturally lead to a fairly warlike society, because, well, generally speaking, it's pretty hard to talk someone into letting you eat them. Generally speaking, most creatures don't like to be murdered and then had for breakfast. Strange things, I know, and it has confused the Kroot on many an occasion, seeing as getting eaten, for the Kroots, is considered a bit of an honour. In fact, they eat their own dead as well. And this isn't because they're hungry or because they need their DNA, or, well, they might be hungry too, but that's beside the point. They do this to honor the fallen spirit. Their thinking is this: once a warrior dies, his spirit is then trapped within his flesh, and the only way to free the spirit is to eat the flesh. Now, you might wonder why you couldn't simply burn it or anything, but, well, the Kroot have decided that the best way to get the spirit out of the flesh is to eat the flesh. Therefore, when they eat an enemy, again, to them, that is a sign of honor, a way of honoring a respected foe. On many an occasion, they have suggested to eat the Tau's dead, but surprisingly enough, the Tau have been somewhat hesitant on the whole idea. I mean, who knows? They might be really fucking delicious, in which case, shit. Subject of how tasty the Tau are aside, though, they did obviously go out of their way to nom all of the other creatures on their home planet, to the point where there's not that many other creatures on their home planet. There are some, and most of them have gotten pretty damn good at avoiding getting eaten, but obviously there is only so much variety of DNA that is possible on a single planet. This quest for bigger and better lovelies to nom on sent the Kroots barreling out into space. Now, again, the Kroot are not a particularly scientifically advanced species, but somehow they managed to hammer together some spaceships, known as war spheres. These gigantic constructs travelled across the local area, finding other and lovely creatures to nom on and devour, or honour, their DNA. This went on for quite a while, and, well, the Kroots were happy. They could wander from planet to planet and nom on all kinds of delicious creatures that would give them oh-so-wonderful abilities. Until, eventually, they met a species that bit back. Unfortunately for the Tau, they ran into the Orcs. Now, the Orcs also are not exactly the best spacefarers in Warhammer 40k, but they're a hell of a lot better than the Kroot, and there's a hell of a lot more Orcs than there were Kroots. Unsurprisingly, this rather hostile encounter led to the almost destruction of the Kroot Empire. Or, well, empire. It wasn't much of an empire, but it was something. And, small though it might be, it was their buffet table, damn it, and they wanted to keep it. The Orcs, of course, disagreed. However, the Kroot were in luck. Eventually, the last remaining bastion of the Kroots and the last remaining port of safety for their war sphere was found by the Orc Armada. However, they had also been found by the Tau. Now, to begin with, the Tau had decided to just sit back and observe. Their ships were far out of sensor range of the Kroot's extremely limited technology, and Orc sensors are, well, Orc-ish. But the Tau commanders could not simply stand idly by and watch the Kroots be defeated. You see, they had been very impressed by the Kroots' way of warfare. They did not run, they did not yield, they were hopelessly outnumbered, they were doomed to die, but they never tried to flee. And it also didn't hurt that they were fighting the Orcs. Already at this early point, the Tau had developed quite a hatred for the green-skinned little fuckers, since they had also invaded Tau space on many occasions. Orcs are not particularly fond of Tau, because they're cowardly little shits, preferring to zip around in their grav vehicles instead of standing and fighting like proper Orcs. But beggars can't be choosers, and, after all, once you actually do catch one of the little blueberries and slowly squeeze, they pop with a most satisfying sound. But that is entirely besides the point. So, the Tau decided to help out the Kroot. It was a small Orc force anyway, so they easily dispatched them with their superior ranged firepower. Only then to find out that this was not all the Orcs. In fact, there was a lot more Orcs coming. But somehow they managed to hold the line, although the Orcs did make it down onto the planet, where the Tau Fire Warriors fought alongside the Kroot and were, again, very impressed by their fighting prowess. In fact, they were so impressed by the Kroot that honor dictated that they would help them out. The Tau offered an alliance to the Kroot. Essentially, the Tau offered to help the Kroot retake their empire. Now, this was an extended war because, well, not entirely sure if the Kroot told them how big their empire was, but eventually they did succeed, and the conflict was later to be known as the War in the Place of Union. And upon the conclusion of the reconquest of the Kroot Empire, the Kroot's legendary leader, Angkor Prok, or however you pronounce that, swore his undying allegiance to the Tau and that of his people. They, in essence, pledged to fight for the greater good and for a very large sack of cash. Now, it should be noted that most Kroot consider the Tau to be their primary beneficiary and therefore employers, but some Kroots do hire out their services to, well, anyone who's willing to pay for it, to be honest. It's even rumoured that the Kroots have hired out their services to the Imperium. Now, not officially, of course, because, well, they're Xeno scum, but the local residents are not quite as crazy Xeno-hating bastards as the rest of the Imperium. They have, after all, lived quite closely with the Tau for a very long time now, and the Tau have expended great amounts of effort to appear peaceful, friendly, and cuddly to the humans, because, of course, they want the humans to join their greater good, or, well, at least they wanted to before they realised quite what a massive fuck-off bear they were poking. Nevertheless, many of the human worlds in the area have in fact been trading with the Tau for quite some while, and risking strict Imperial censure if this was ever discovered. Let's just say that if a world is discovered to have had constant trade dealings with the Tau Empire, well, if the world is lucky, then the ruling elite will essentially just be wiped off the planet and replaced with a far more zealous bunch of bastards. And if the planet is unlucky and the Imperium decides that an example needs to be set, well, it is not entirely unknown for the Imperium to mass deport the population of an entire planet and force them into penal legions and send them to fight the orcs and then repopulate the planet with fresher, more skeptical stock. Granted, this is a rather extreme solution, but, well, let's just say that the Imperium is very interested in making damn fucking sure that anyone who lives in that area knows that that's an option. As for how these mercenaries fight, well, they prefer close combat. Back in the day, before they met the Tau, they use a simple slug-firing weapon. The weapon was later redesigned by the Tau. It still more or less remains the same outwardly, but it now fires a charged particle, similar to the Tau's pulse rifles, rather than just good old-fashioned bullets. Although, it's not quite as effective as the Tau's pulse rifles, because the Kroot rifles have to be built specifically to be used in close-quarters combat. In fact, the weapon is less based off a traditional rifle, and more based off a traditional Kroot quarterstaff close-quarter combat weapon. The Kroot have also grown quite adept at using their various subspecies in combat, using Kroot hounds as fast attack choices, using the big old Krootoxes as essentially mobile heavy weapon platforms with a pair of solid hands on it to smack people about, and the great Narlox, which is, well, to put it simply, the closest thing the Kroot have ever come to making a tank. By the way, on that point, here's an interesting little note. Now, as I mentioned previously, the Kroots are not a very scientifically advanced race, but they managed to figure out spacecraft and projectile weapons with using bullets and stuff. So you'd think they would have at least some scientific basis, and indeed they do. Now, the Kroots keep this a well-guarded secret, but the Tau seems to have come up with a bit of a theory on it. Long-range and very secretive Tau scans of the Kroot home planet of Peck seems to suggest that the Kroots have large underground facilities, possibly factories and laboratories, which they use to develop just the technology they needed. Spacefaring to get out into the galaxy and feast on the great DNA variety out there, and weapons enough to overcome anything they would probably run into. But nothing that would make the species soft. No luxuries, no amenities, no TV, no sports, no football, no cuddly things whatsoever. An interesting thing, in fact, I'd be interested in discussing the sociological aspects of the Kroot, because I have a hard time thinking that any species would constantly deny themselves luxuries purely for the sake of remaining strong. Because, well, in our current history, that pretty much has never happened. In fact, the various areas that has tried to remain strong, like for example Sparta or the Norse Vikings, eventually got shat on by the people that went for luxury. It's an interesting little thing, and probably a hell of a lot more complicated than what I just said, but still, I find it hard to believe that an entire species would, in a conscious move, disavow all forms of luxury, you know? Just baffles the mind, but then again, it has to be mentioned, of course, that the Kroot evolve via eating other creatures, which necessitates them being able to beat and therefore eat the other creature. If the goal of Tau society as a whole is purely to evolve and become stronger, then that would explain it. But again, I find it hard to believe that that could become the overriding goal of an entire species. Granted, there are certainly some religious and spiritual aspects to this quest for ever greater power and, well, perfection, kinda. Which makes me wonder if we're going to be seeing Slaneshi Kroot anytime soon. Ugh. Nevertheless, it is an interesting question. Oh, and speaking of their whole mercenary nature and going out to find DNA, their contract with the Tau is technically an exclusive contract. The Kroot are technically not allowed to hire themselves out to other species. They do it anyway, but technically speaking, they're not allowed to do so. Again, this is all in the quest of a wider variety of DNA samples. Now, the Tau, of course, know this because they're the Tau, but they have kind of given up on changing the Kroot. They do still hold out a little bit of hope that eventually their superior civilization and the greater good will rub off on these feathered barbarians, like, for example, making them stop eating their own dead at the very least. I mean, okay, go on, eat other species, but could you at least lay off your own people? I mean, Jesus, have some manners. To be fair though, most Kroots do make a conscious effort to not show their cannibalistic tendencies around the Tau because they know it triggers them. But while you should never say never, I find it pretty hard to imagine that the Kroots being willing to forswear all forms of luxuries to pursue this goal is going to be talked into stopping their pursuit of said goal just because the Tau feel a little bit queasy about their dinner habits. And with that, I'll wrap up this video on the Kroot. I'm probably going to make a couple smaller ones as well at some point, detailing the variants of Kroots, like the Kroot Hounds and the Krootoks and the Great Narlock, of course, but those will probably be shorter videos, for one of those weeks where I'm just feeling like a lazy little slob. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.